Good afternoon, everybody. We have three speakers this afternoon covering three very important topics. I'm sure that you would enjoy. I've gone through their qualification and certainly will be very, very proud to have such distinguished speakers. Our first speaker is Bernardo Fort-Brescia, very well known. He had graduated from Harvard and taught in Harvard, and I don't want to really go further because I'm sure that you came to listen to him, not to me.
Good afternoon. Well, it's a pleasure to be in India, and I'm going to touch on a subject that has become quite relevant around the world, and that is that new cities are being created within cities. And this subject is relevant because in the sustainable world that we live in today, it is logical to profit from the existing infrastructure, utility, transport, and other aspects of land that has been decommissioned over history because of the changing patterns of society, because of industry moving out or ports moving to different locations, rail yards that may not need large depots in the middle of the city, which have opened up parcels of land that are so enormous that they actually are creating entire cities. And I'm going to begin by talking about some of the precedents that led us to consider what we are doing in some of the projects in the region. And I like to begin with this image because this image tells us so much about the problems that we face today. What you see in front of you is one of the most successful, unfortunately successful, places in the world. This is Scottsdale, Arizona. It is a whole new town that happened directly in the outskirts of Phoenix. And if you see that image, you notice that it has major arterial roads with gated communities within them. Often there's no veins through which you can go through. There's very little that is shared. Every house has its own lot. Almost every house has its own swimming pool. Many of them have their own tennis courts. And you have to drive everywhere because the density is so low that no mass transit could ever serve a community of this magnitude. It is, if you look within it, you see these large patches of dark gray, which are asphalt parking lots around strip centers and shopping centers, which often go up to about 140 degrees of temperature in the surrounding space because of the heat island effect. It is, and therefore, I want you to remember this when I show you other images. And in the second image that I want to make reference is that this is the Cité Radieuse, the radiant city of Le Corbusier, much maligned, but yet with many of the first ideas of sustainability. In fact, in this new city that he was creating outside Paris, there was offices, retail, residential institutions, everything that was needed, even factories, everything that was needed to function internally as one city. And there were obviously certain aspects of human values and quality of life that were questionable. And but when you look at the residential district that he was creating, you can see that parks and schools and gardens are all shared. They happen in courtyards where all these facilities are shared by the residents. Even he had green roofs, much of what we talk today. And you can actually connect the buildings, one with the other. You could actually run on the roofs of buildings and connect them all as one. Of course, there were we all know the issues of scale. In fact, the buildings were actually elevated and you can walk under and the air would flow under those buildings. Not advocating the continuous wall that he was creating, but there are many aspects of some of the principles that we often are looking today. There were funny aspects to it also. I mean, he was trying to connect this city with other cities and internally with a huge transportation system. There were cars, trains, and airplanes, helicopters, everything converging. In fact, in 1920, when he created this, there were no large planes. So he thought that this was an airport and that the airplanes could land in the middle of the city, as you see in this platform. So when we look at La Défense in Paris, a place where our office is involved in several projects, and more recently in the rethinking of what La Défense will be in the future, even La Défense is reconsidering some of these principles, but La Défense is essentially that platform of the Radiant City. And here you can see the giant platform with very little shade, no light and darkness. There's no contrast. There's a giant platform. You arrive from below. There's no human contact upon arrival with the space. You're essentially in an underground under this raised platform, and all of this is part of the questioning today. But if you look at this image, it reminds us of the Radiant City. You can see the existing residential neighborhoods around in Colombes and other cities around La Défense, and the center core of office buildings that are tall, while the residential was mid-rise, almost identical with a big platform. And but there was a real value. Look at what La Défense was before. And it's hard to imagine that France could have been like this in 1965. But in fact, after World War II, at that time, there were 15 million people in France with appropriate housing. And it is this condition that you see here that created La Défense. You see La Défense under construction, the big shopping center behind that was happening. But what is it that La Défense created? There were certain good things. It saved Paris because all those, the growth of corporate France moved there, and it prevented that black rectangle that you see there, the Tour de Montparnasse, from happening. But this view also tells us about density versus open space and how the density of Paris allowed it to have mass transit. Today, in Paris, you don't have to walk more than 300 yards, that is about 300 meters, to a transit station or to a bicycle station. There are bicycle stations where you can pick up a bike and deliver it somewhere else at a maximum distance of 300 meters. That is, that every subway station and bicycle station is 600 meters apart. And it makes it one of the most sustainable cities. And the green space continues to exist. In fact, in La Défense, there have been these series of viaducts. This is how you arrived to La Défense, through this image that you see here. And in fact, it is with one of them has already been demolished, which our firm was involved in, and created a linear park and actually inserted a whole new building in place of that viaduct. And that building now reaches the ground. You can see the slope going through and green space, and you can see the open space and trees and other normal aspects of city life happening within the surroundings of that building, which was once an expressway. Not too far from there, you can see another tower that we're involved in, another building that is replacing a series of buildings that were obsolete and densifying the city and coming again all the way to the ground with no more podium. You can see the change of elevation back to the ground, and eventually it will be all back to ground plane in La Défense. And these are some of the images of the sustainable facade, a non-mechanized double skin which creates a microcosm, a new microclimate between the exterior and the interior. And I pick another example before I show you a new city in New York. These are the Hudson Yards, 60 blocks of the city. When our firm started the replanning of this other new city inside the city, we counted a total of 25 trees in the 60-block area in the survey that we did. It is, and we came up with a whole new plan. But when you see what is New York, doesn't it remind you of that image of Paris? A huge amount of green space, a lung for the city in the middle, and extremely high density in the perimeter, which permits, again, transit to allow people to go around the city without the use of a private car. It is this notion, and you wonder why there aren't more green roofs in New York, but there is one thing about New York that is great. It is one of the first cities that actually have what I would call urban agriculture. And we learned how Singapore nowadays is looking into urban agriculture, because its acreage for production of food has gone down so highly from something like 15,000 to 1,500 hectares of land are left in Singapore. In New York, you notice that we created a linear park that actually traverses these blocks and creates a whole new green belt around which the dense buildings are lined up, and creates this sort of green zone that actually eventually bends and goes all the way to the Hudson River and connects to the parks that have replaced the ports. Everything you see here is over rail tracks, and many of them decommissioned. But the most important aspect of this project is that other L-shaped line, is a number 7 line that finally brought mass transit. This so-called Hell's Kitchen was called precisely that because it had no access to the city. New Yorkers are the ultimate green people. They will not go where there's no mass transit. And the city will not develop, and there will be pockets of dead city as a result of that. And the extension of the number 7, was transformed the west side of New York in Midtown into what will be this new master plan with open spaces and green spaces and major buildings that will transform the place. Reusing infrastructure is probably one of the great tenets of green design. There was the High Line there that was a rail line that was elevated. It became a park. And this park now traverses all these neighborhoods. People can go jogging for blocks without having to stop at a crossing, and actually goes under buildings and through buildings, something that is an amazing example of the reuse of existing structures instead of demolishing them. It is not new, because even in Paris, where there was also an elevated viaduct, shops were introduced below and a linear park was above. It is, in fact, what's happened in New York is the second place in the world where a rail line has been converted. I'll show you a few other examples of other projects that we're involved in. This is in Prague, where also the rail yards in Prague, the Orko, the development company, is redeveloping into a whole new city right off the river across from downtown. You can see there will be these were all rail depots, maintenance yards, and factories that are now becoming part of the city. In the middle of it is a major train station that will be the connection of the TGV to Paris, where we will meet the internal railroad metro that will go through the city of Prague. And you can see the internal park in the center, and the mega project that we are currently in design, where the train station will occur that will feed into the city and into the neighborhood. It is, there are other cities that we learn from, and it'll be surprising when you see this view. This is the town of Curitiba in Brazil. Not a town, a huge, enormous city. What is great about Curitiba is that 80% of the population uses mass transit. In a developing country like Brazil, they figured, this is one of our projects there, that buses, they couldn't afford to do a subway. It was extremely expensive, the water table, the cost of removing the fumes, the air that has to be pumped into the rail. Why couldn't we have mass transit above grade? They developed this transit stops that are elevated at the height of the train, with a ramp on one side and steps on the other. Ventilation, the air flows right through the middle, it's protected from the rain, and this is such an easy way of going around the city, such an economical way. Why is this? Because Brazil doesn't allow any public transportation that doesn't use ethanol. It's all 100% ethanol based. It doesn't pollute, and it is an amazing way of solving the transportation problem in a developing country where the money to create a subway system is extremely high. Today I'm going to show you a project, a master plan that we're doing in the center of Abu Dhabi. And this is a very commendable project. You see the little rectangle, and later I'm going to show you the island up on top that is next to downtown Abu Dhabi. But that little rectangle is not so little. Within it, you can fit about 14 million square feet of construction. It is in the center of the city. This is not a new island or some new construction in the outskirts of the city that you have to go to. It's smack in the middle. And one of the great things about it is, and it's amazing, is that these were the original palace grounds of the ruler of Abu Dhabi, of the elder ruler of Abu Dhabi. His palace was in the center, and the surrounding space was his experimental garden, where he had a botanical arboretum, where he experimented with trees of the desert, and in the other half, he had an agricultural field where he tested the growth of edible plants that could grow in the desert environment of Abu Dhabi. It is also commendable that the family decided to turn this into part of the city, instead of keeping it as a palace occupied by one person. And the ruler moved to a palace outside the city, and now this will become part of the city. You can see that we're trying to connect to the city grid and precisely avoid the notion of only arteries and no veins. And you can see here how the project fits into the city itself with a central park with urban agriculture. It will have an actual agricultural fields on one half of the site and an arboretum with trees and other species on the right-hand side. And it will become the centerpiece. The building, the old palace will be converted, not demolished, into a museum. And the buildings that surround it create a variety of lifestyles. There's high-rise office buildings, high-rise residential, mid-rise, low-rise, townhouses, hotels. There's every aspect of city life occurs around this central park. In this analysis of the uses, you can see, I'm going to not take you through every color, but the colors signify different purposes and different uses to create a total city within these 15 million square feet. And how the streets are positioned aligned with the surrounding streets so that the traffic can actually flow through the block instead of having to go through the perimeter, an edge road in the city. You can see here there's 40% of the space is open space, and this is important because the temperature drops significantly. A green space is about 70 degrees in the heat of a desert, but a solid space is actually 140 degrees. That is 50% of the heat will be absorbed by soft spaces that are green spaces. And that's why the project has a significant percentage of green roofs and other components that are soft. These are some of the institutional aspects, but more importantly is the transport. Notice how it is surrounded by the public transport in the city. There's a subway station, the major rail at the corner, a high-frequency road over to the right, high-frequency transit line on the right, and a light rail that surrounds two other sides, and we have an internal loop with a small tram that takes you around the different properties within here. These are some of the analysis that we did with respect to sun and air, and some of the quantification using the Istedama system on how to quantify the value of the use of water. The ability to use the gray water from the buildings for non-potable uses and for irrigating the garden in the center, the use of energy and indoor environmental quality and other aspects. And notice one of the very high numbers is waste management. And in fact, we forget how important waste management is and what we do with waste in a city. And it is part of the standards that are imposed in a property like this. This is the view of what we call An Manhal will be. Adjacent to it, we are also the architects and planners of the adjacent block, which is another 50% of it, another 7 million square feet, creating a whole new city. I mean, cities are created often of that population, and it need not be a new town somewhere at a long distance. It can actually happen in spaces that are decommissioned in the center of cities. This is the botanical garden and the agricultural garden in the center of the site, and you can see the palace and the botanical garden that is entirely made of plants that do not need irrigation, that are natural to the place. And these are some of the other views of the different aspects of the streetscape, including shade trees that help control the temperature, overhangs and that protect from the sun, arcades that connect the buildings undercover so that people can walk from building to building protected from the sun as well. It is not too far from it that we were involved in the initial planning for this island directly across from downtown, immediately across from downtown, as an island that existed with enormous sand dune in the center, and which has its economy based on the resort economy along the waterfront with beaches and islands along the waterfront, and on the inner side of the island, residential neighborhoods that feed the city. These are quite high density residential. There's a population of about 35,000 people that will occupy this island. It is low rise in the sense of a Parisian low rise, but with a significant density within it. And you can see here the land use plan with the mixed uses, and it goes all the way from homes to mid-rises to very dense neighborhoods. As you depart from the transit lines that you see in this transportation analysis, the density drops because people in homes are less likely to use the mass transit, and you go to higher densities as you approach the mass transit areas. We did a plan like we did in Al Manhal of all the uses and the use of the canals as activators and the water's edge. And these are some of the different views of the project as it was being developed. It is, and you can see here the various densities of buildings and fairly dense blocks around an open space, including office space and residential and other uses. There are many other cities in Asia that are involved in such endeavors of creating cities within cities. This is in Seoul, Korea. Directly in the center of the city, you see this island that has been created for a new financial district, a new La Défense, but it has residential, has shops, is multi-use, it's not a pure financial center. It has a park that crosses right through. This is our project in the middle of this island. And there are other very commendable efforts in the reuse of infrastructure. In Hong Kong, at the old Kai Tak Airport, the government is planning a whole redo of that airport into a part of the city. We are not the planners of this, but we've learned about it through the project that we're involved in right there. And another great example that you'll see here from China in the creation of cities that are directly adjacent to existing city centers, trying to use the energy infrastructure and life of cities as part of the expansion of a city. And the Pudong was probably the best example, and this is another one of those places where we're involved in various projects. And we do create whole new towns, and this is in Shenyang, also next to the city at the convergence of the rivers, one of the new projects that we're involved in. And I do have to say something important on the sustainable side about Chinese cities. And I promise you this is the last slide. It is that in China, they understand the value of the sun and of wind and orientation. And we talk so much about producing energy, but more important is to save energy. In fact, if we save energy, then we don't have to produce as much. And it is in China, every residential unit has to be oriented to the south or no more than 15% off the southern exposure. That is that every residential unit gets sun in the northern climates of northern China. It helps with radiant heat in the winter. It gets natural light, and we all know that daylighting is probably the biggest contributor to savings in energy. In Europe, there's strict rules of the depth of a building between the core and the edge. Everybody has to have an office right next to a window. Everybody has natural light, and that reduces enormously the consumption of electricity. Not only do they not use the power of the lights, but the lights generate heat, and they themselves create more need for air conditioning. And the Chinese, in our experience in China, has been amazing in the sense of in their sensitivity towards the value of the sun in planning. Thank you very much.